versus the interest of the late Dr. Neil Aggett, case number 445 of 2019.
As the court pleases, with the leave of the court, my lord, I'd like to hand up two exhibits that are relevant for this morning. That's the original affidavit of Keith Coleman, which we'd like to mark as G7, as well as a copy of the short affidavit that he made out before the first inquest, which we would like to mark as G28. My lord, I should mention that the affidavit of Mr. Coleman was made before the first inquest is currently not part of the record of the first inquest handed up by the investigating officer. It's part of what we have been referring to as the missing record in folder B2. We should be in a position within a few days to let the court and the parties have what we think is much or most of that missing folder B2, including many of the statements that we haven't previously had access to. And Lord, those records, as we mentioned previously, were located in the archives of the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. Yep.
What is G28?
So G28 is the statement made by Mr. Coleman, which was handed up as an exhibit before the first inquest. It appears that this affidavit was in folder B2 at page 1008. Lord, with the leave of the court, we'd like to call to the stand Mr. Keith Coleman.
Please state your full names and surname.
Keith Coleman.
Do you have any objection in taking the oath?
I'd like to affirm.
Do you affirm that you will tell the truth, nothing but the truth? If so, say you do.
I do.
As the court pleases, Mr. Coleman, we understand that you've had to travel from London to be with us today.
Yes, I have.
And on behalf of the family, we're very grateful that you have made the time and made the trip to come and testify before court today. We're also aware that we are expecting you to relive experiences that you endured in security branch detention. And we're acutely aware that this requires you to revisit periods that are traumatic and that caused you considerable pain. And I can assure you that the court is understanding of your position and that of the other witnesses who had to do the same.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
And should you wish to take a breather, some water, please provide the witness with. You have water. If you need to take a breather or a break at any time, please indicate that to answer questions. You should address yourself to the court.
I'll do so. I was born in Johannesburg, 4 September 1960.
On the 7th of February this year.
I do.
And you confirm that this is your affidavit.
It is.
And you also have in your possession a copy of the short affidavit that was put up before the first inquest.
I do.
What is your current occupation, Mr. Coleman?
I'm the chief executive of an agri-tech company called Susewi.
And if we may ask, what is Susewi? What does it do?
Susewi is a new technology. It's a green technology. We grow food in the desert, algae, using sunlight, seawater, and carbon dioxide.
Thank you. Let's not turn to that part of your life, your pre-detention period, and perhaps you can describe to the court how it was that you got involved in political activism.
My lord, I first got involved in political activism when I was still at school. After the 1976 uprising, I became much more aware of politics in South Africa. I'd been brought up in a liberal family that taught me what I think are good values. And my brother at that point was at university, and he was politically active there, my brother Neil. In 1977, I got involved in politics on campus, although I was still at school. On the anniversary of June 16, 1977, we put up crosses on the lawns at the university. I also got involved in a demonstration against John Vorster speaking on campus. So before I went to university, I was already involved, mainly through my brother. By the time I went to university, I was already politically aware and politically active. And
when you say university, do you mean Wits University?
I went to Wits University, registered for a BA, partly to stay out of the army as well at that time, but also because that was my continuation of my education. And I became chairperson of the Student African Movement at that point, a few months after going on to Wits, and that was a left-wing political association at Wits. At that point, I got involved with a group of people. Oret van Heerden was the president of NewsAS at the time, and his brother Clive and myself became quite strongly bonded. We worked together and later lived together in a house, and we carried on our political activism from that point forward.
In fact, you mentioned in your affidavit that you became part of a core group of white activists under the leadership of Oret van Heerden. Were there any other individuals at that time who struck out as also key members of this core group?
Yes, there were. Initially, it was mainly on the excuse me, maybe on the Wits campus and other NewsAS campuses. People like Jonathan Jaffe, Lisa Seftel, Avril Jaffe, many others. And Oret was working with people like Barbara Hogan, Cedric de Beer, Fink Haysom. And so there was a group that was emerging that was very strong. We strategized together initially on campus activities, but by 1979 we moved off campus and we started to work with people in the townships who were forming COSAS. We helped mobilize and get going the Release Mandela campaign. I personally was writing articles that were published in the World and the Weekend World, obviously not under my name, that were delivered in some secrecy, about the ANC, about the history of the Freedom Charter, about the history of Mandela. And so we started to get involved in a range of off-campus activity, obviously in secret. not because it was illegal, but because we knew the security police would take umbrage with anything that was connecting black and white activists. But we carried on anyway, and it became quite a core part of our work that whilst we were based on the white campuses and appearing to do work mainly around NUSAS and later SASPU, South African Student Press Union activities, most of our work was in fact happening off campus.
And you mentioned in the affidavit that you also worked with organizations such as the Congress of South African Students, COSAS, as well as the Azanian Students Organization of South Africa, AZASA. Just briefly, what was the nature of your work with them?
So in around about 1979, we, excuse me, we became, I was introduced to Job Ngwenya, who was one of the founding fathers, as it were. He was too young to be a father, but he was one of the founding brains of COSAS. He and a bunch of other activists were starting COSAS, and we gave support. We gave support in terms of political strategy, media services. We would help write pamphlets. We'd help produce posters, and generally we started to become a resource that was available. We used what resources were available on the campus to take them off campus. Similarly with the ZASO, it was a reach across between black and white campuses. The state had previously divided the campuses through kind of banning activities and clamping down. And this was the first period when black and white campuses started to get together again, and we started to reach across those racial divides which had been reimposed after the 1976 period.
So you mentioned that you were not a member of the ANC and you didn't take instructions from the ANC, but you did carry out some activities that were supportive of the ANC. What kinds of activities were those?
Very much so, my lord. We were sympathetic to the aims of the ANC and the Freedom Charter. We had a very strong view that we shouldn't, what we call, mix our drinks. We shouldn't do above-ground activity as well as underground activity. We were obviously supportive of people who were doing underground activity and were sympathetic to their cause, but our view was that it was dangerous to mix the drinks. Nonetheless, there were occasions when, for example, Clive van Heerden and myself would make photocopies of ANC literature, South African Communist Party literature, and Conte Wesizwe literature. We made literally thousands of copies of such literature. I remember photocopying this in the back of Cedric Mason's house. And then we would distribute it through our connections in the townships and the unions and rural areas. And we created these book boxes of literature that came from the ANC. That was deemed to be illegal at the time. As far as we were concerned, it was about relearning history and reconnecting to the past and to the tradition of struggle which we were broadly sympathetic with. And but nonetheless, that activity got people into trouble. One person in particular was Guy Berger, who I delivered that literature to, and he got a 5-year sentence for merely possessing that literature.
So in 1980, you mentioned that you and others started a national newspaper known as SASPU National. You've already made reference to it. And it appears that you spent a significant amount of your time working on this newspaper. Can you give an indication to the court why you formed it and what kind of role it played?
So SASPU stands for the South African Students Press Union. There was very strict legislation governing newspapers at the time, so we formed it under the banner of SASPU, and it was legalistically we was distributing it on the campuses, which made it a private newspaper. In reality, we were distributing it off campus. Probably 90% of the copies that we produced were distributed through the COSAS channels, through the trade unions and various other channels. The intention behind the newspaper was to give an alternative voice. The commercial newspapers were not reporting entirely accurately on what was going on in the country at the time. Some were bravely trying, but we believed that we needed an alternative reporting tool, so something that could tell news that wasn't coming out elsewhere. Excuse me. Secondly, it was a means by which we could distribute historical perspective and give stories about the past, and do what we were doing in the world, through the world and the weekend world, on a regular basis. So it was an educational tool. Thirdly, it gave a direct access to, for example, trade union leaders to speak without being edited, and we had a lot of interviews with student leaders. Commercial journalists worked on the newspaper, so the chief sub-editor of the Sunday Times actually designed the newspaper, the look and feel of it, and a lot of professional journalists worked on it, and we gave cameras out in communities, and we had community journalists also working on it. So it was quite a broad newspaper, distributed nationally, and I was the editor together with Clive.
And by all accounts, it had quite a big impact in different communities at that time.
Indeed. At its height, we printed about 60,000 copies. We estimate we had about 250,000 readers, pretty much all activists. We heard quite a few stories of people holding on to their copies after they were banned for possession and being arrested as a result. But it was very welcomed, and we got a lot of letters, we got a lot of offers of stories, and it was very actively supported by broad communities across the country.
Mr. Coleman, if we can now turn to how it was that you first got to meet and know Neil Aggett.
My lord, it was through the newspaper that in fact I got to meet Neil for the first time, and Liz. As I was saying, we used to distribute the newspaper through the unions. The Food and Canning Workers Union was one of the key unions that we gave a voice to. We did interviews, we got news, and we published articles about the union. Neil actually also took copies of the newspaper to distribute within his branches. And I delivered them personally to Neil. I got to know him not very well. He was a comrade rather than a friend, but I got to know him well enough to get a measure of Neil at those times. He was a very impressive individual, and I always enjoyed the opportunity of going to deliver the newspapers to him. In September, I think it was 1981, we did a big feature on the Food and Canning Workers Union, and I got some input from Neil on that article.
So, Mr. Coleman, while we're talking about Neil Aggett, the person, why would you describe him as impressive?
Neil was a person of great integrity, little ego, very committed. He was a person of stillness. He didn't have to show off. He had that stillness that comes with certainty, that comes with modesty, and he was always a very gracious human being. He always engaged you in a way that made you feel properly engaged, and it was impressive. It felt good to be around Neil.
Thank you. You then indicate that by October of 1981, SASB National had now become a clear target for the security system, in particular the security branch. Why did you say that?
There were multiple attempts to stop the newspaper under censorship legislation. We were banned for possession many times and banned for distribution many times. We developed this cat and mouse game where the general rule of thumb was if you were banned for 3 times in a row, you would be banned for all future editions, essentially shutting down the paper. So we would produce 2 hard copies, 2 hard editions which had full reports, and then 1 soft one, which just reported on what was going on the campuses, which was impossible to ban. We also developed a stable of newspapers just in case. We produced a second newspaper called SASB Focus and another one called State of the Nation. And we frustrated the security police. We knew that they were after a lot of people who were distributing the paper. They would not, when they found the newspaper, they would not only take the newspapers, but they would take the person with the newspapers as well. But there was also a broader context where we were part of that broader group I described under Oret's leadership, and there was a lot of other activities going on as well: media production, assistance with educational workshops, and so on. We were connected to the unions, to student groups, and so on. So within that broader context, they saw SASB National as a threat, but also the work we were doing as a group as a threat. And they were very frustrated by that. We were followed a lot, and they would raid the printers, and they tried to stop on several occasions us getting our publication printed. So we jumped from printer to printer, and we always gave out false information about where it was being printed. It was a difficult time, but we carried on. Yeah.
And you also indicated in your statement that around this time you sensed that the state was being frustrated because they couldn't crack this activist network, as you call it. Do you wish to elaborate on that?
My lord, they knew that there was a network that was building and forming and becoming stronger. So we had meetings in secret with Praveen Gordon in Durban, with Trevor Manuel in Cape Town, with Cheryl Carolus, with Tozamili Botha in Port Elizabeth. Our network was forming. Obviously, under the banner of the newspaper, I was able to present myself as a journalist going about my work, collecting articles. But they knew that there was more than that going on, and that this internal movement was becoming very powerful. There was clearly more and more coordination, and the distance we travelled between 1978 and 1981 as an internal movement was quite significant. There were boycotts, there were strikes, there was a lot of open political debate about how to create a revolution in the country, how to bring down apartheid, how to win democracy, and they could see the levels of coordination were growing. So within that context, they were trying really hard to find a way of cracking down. I think there was a difference in the type of activism that there was at that point, in the sense that it was not purely driven by underground work. It wasn't driven purely by ANC operatives, although there were obviously connections between the external ANC and the internal movement through particular individuals, a lot of what I'm describing were internal activists coming together and creating an internal movement that was not obviously illegal. And this was very frustrating for them.
So you, as a young man, you were acutely aware of the risks of this activism that you were involved in. And it seems as if you were having discussions with your colleagues and comrades to prepare yourselves for detention. What kind of steps or what kind of discussions were you having to deal with that eventuality or possibility?
Inevitability, I think it was. Obviously, at that point, interacting with people like the COSAS network, people like Wantuzenzile, people like Jabu, were detained on multiple occasions and immediately tortured. Most of the black activists I knew were at some point detained and tortured. We knew that it was part of being an activist, was that detention was likely, torture was happening frequently, and we spoke about it. We spoke about how we would deal with interrogation, and there were some things that we learned from those who had been through it. Of course, one never knows exactly what it's going to be like. We were young, we were determined, we had bravado, I would say. In 1980, 1981, I was 21 years old. So I was still young enough to be filled with fervour and naive enough in a way to believe that I could deal with whatever they threw at me. And there was a strong sense of comradeship, camaraderie, a sense of loyalty. And we knew that we would do our best for each other. We also knew, unfortunately, that people broke. People were broken by torture. One person I knew did break after his sixth terrible interrogation. And he came out of detention having broken, and immediately told everybody, well, not everybody, told his close comrades that he'd broken, and they got him out the country immediately, and he was taken out and made safe. So I'd seen examples of how people who had broken would be treated, and what, in a sense, the protocols were around that. So, in summary, my lord, there was frequent discussion, and our group discussed how we would handle it. And in my particular case, I had the cover, so to speak, of being a journalist. And so everybody I met, I had a story to tell as to why I met them, was to get some news, or to write an article of sorts. And that's a story I did stick with in my subsequent detention.
So then, Mr. Coleman, the inevitability happened, and you make reference that this in fact started with the detention of Oret van Heerden in September 1981. Perhaps you can pick up the story from his detention.
So Oret, Barbara, Gavin were people who were of our network. And we realized...
Sorry, to be clear, when you mentioned Barbara and Gavin, you are referring
Barbara
to...
Hogan, Gavin Anderson.
Thank you.
And others who were detained at that time in September. And it was apparent that they were going for the leadership. They were people senior to me in our network. And it was likely that the detentions would spread. Of course, we discussed it at the time in a response, and the response was to organise protests, but also to keep going. I remember producing an issue of Saspi National in September 1981, after the detentions. And so we kept going, but we were aware that we could be taken at any time. In October, the security police, I understand 14 security police, raided the flat where Clive and I lived in Yeovil. I was not home that night. I was staying with my girlfriend elsewhere in Yeovil. Finkaysum came and got me and said, "You'd better go because they're after you." They were apparently, the security police were driving around Yeovil looking for me. They also went to my parents' house. Captain Struvig went to my parents' house and looked for me there. That night and the next night, I convened a meeting in secret with my group, my reference group, as it were, and we discussed the situation. It was very difficult. The one option was to leave the country, which I did not want to do. The second option was to go into hiding and to run. The view that we took was that would look very bad for both Clive and Orette and others, that it would appear as if I had something to hide, and therefore that they had something to hide as well. The choice was mine, having worked through it, but I decided that the course of action to follow was to hand myself in, and to do so in all innocence, as it were, as if I had nothing to hide. So I went to my parents' home. My father phoned Captain Struvig, who'd left his number there, and said, "My son will answer your questions, and we'll come in and we'll meet you, and you can ask him your questions." Because Struvig had said to my father, "I just want to ask him a few questions." I packed a bag, a few clothes, and a Bible. And we went, my father, my brother Neil and myself, we went to John Vorster Square. It was a Sunday. And handed myself over to Struvig. Struvig immediately detained me under Section 22, which was a 14-day detention period. As he was about to take me off, my father turned to him and said, "I hold you personally responsible for anything that happens to my son. If you touch a hair on my son's head, you will have me to answer to." And I remember Struvig taking a step back. He could see my father was not to be trifled with. And he then took me off to the cells. And
you also indicate that your father said that you had a bad back and that you would need proper medical attention.
That's correct. My father said to him, "My son has a bad back, and I expect you to be aware of that and to take care of that, and he'll need medical attention."
If we can just pause for a moment, Mr. Coleman. I understand that your parents, Max and Audrey, then played quite an active role in trying to improve conditions for detainees. If you could just describe that role briefly.
My father, Max and Audrey, my mum was already involved in activities in the Black Sash. My dad and mum were both politically aware people. My father was a businessman at the time, running a company. The day I was detained, I understand he stopped working, and they both became full-time involved in the Detainee Parent Support Committee, which was a committee that was set up by the families of the detainees in September. And my parents in October became very actively involved themselves. It was I knew nothing of this. I was completely sealed off from this. I only learned about this upon my release. But it was a group that fought for the release of detainees, and also the improvement of their conditions, and campaigned actively. After I was released, I read my father's daily diary, and it recalls all the letters, the visits, the phone calls he made. I can indeed say that my parents harassed the security police, probably more than they managed to harass me in my life. Yeah. So they were very brave, and they played an active role from then on, way after my release, in fact.
Very impressive indeed. So you were then taken to the second floor cells, and I understand that certain items were removed from you. Do you recall which items?
Yes, the bag I took was removed from me. My belt, my shoelaces. I was told that I was not to be left with anything that would be a suicide risk. This is to prevent me from committing suicide. I mean, Captain Struvig, simply marched me into the cells, told the warder there which cell I was to go in, and walked off. There was no paperwork. I remember being struck by the power of that, the control that they had over the cells, over me. Obviously nobody knew who I was. The warder didn't even know who I was. Struvig was the only person at that point who knew where I was.
And you found your cell to be rather grim and somewhat shocking.
It was a shock. The walk from the charge office in John Vorster Square in handcuffs through these passages in this maze up these stairs, that was very disorientating. And then in the cell, just seeing a cell for the first time, it was quite a shock. What it looked like. And in particular, I got the greatest shock when I went over to this single mat that was in the corner of the cell, and there was a blanket there with blood on it. And that was my introduction to solitary confinement.
And you were then taken out your cell every day for interrogation for the next 6 weeks. Can you give the court a sense of your daily routine over those 6 weeks?
My lord, the day would begin with me being given some breakfast, some food. It's too great to describe it as breakfast. I would then have a shower, and I would then be taken up to Major Cronwright's office, where Cronwright would be sitting with Struvig, Warrant Officer Prince, and various other security policemen. I've got to say first that the first question that Struvig asked me on our walk down to the cell was, "Is jy 'n Jood? Are you a Jew?" And I replied, "What does that have to do with anything?" And he said to me, "Jy is 'n Jood. You are a Jew. Jy is 'n fucking Jood. You're a fucking Jew." Excuse my language. But it was a shock. And from then on, I was always fucking Jood. So I was never addressed as Keith. I was always, that's how they addressed me. And from the first moment in Cronwright's office, that was my name. And Cronwright would just shout and scream at me, and he was incoherent. He was clearly crazy. He was clearly psychotic. He was one of the most insane people I'd met. He was incoherent, but he would just scream. I would then have security policemen standing around me, a few inches from me, screaming at me as well. And they would do this. They would just shout questions. They would shout things at me. And then they would ask me a question or two. I would then be taken off to another room by Strivik and Prince, and they would do the same thing again. So there was a period of just verbal assault, I guess, and abuse. And then they would tell me to write. And I would write about my upbringing, and then they would come in and they would tear it up and make me start again. They would ask a few more questions, and they'd say, write about that. So I'd write something, and they'd come in and they'd scream at me and tear it up again. And this happened for, a week or so, every day, until I'd write something that they would value, and then they'd say, okay, now write something else. And slowly I would write about my activities. I don't know how much you want me to go into it, but there were some specific questions I asked as well.
Perhaps we can just pause for a moment and return to your interaction with Cronwright. In paragraph 31 of your statement, you mentioned something quite interesting, that you said he intended to beat the devil out of all the communists.
Yes. It was the sort of thing he would say, that he was a true Christian, and he would beat the devil out of the communists who were against God, and it's a sort of thing that he would say, and I believe he was driven by this zeal. He was obviously violently anti-communist, and he was clearly prepared to do anything to beat the communists.
You mentioned that you were then interrogated by Strivik and Prince. Were those your primary interrogators?
They were.
Did you ever come across Lieutenant Stephen Whitehead? Did he perhaps interrogate you?
No, I didn't.
Now, during this 6-week period of interrogation, you indicate that you were deprived of certain privileges. What were they?
We had not yet got to the point where we would have food parcels or anything like that. But I was allowed only a Bible in the cell. I wasn't allowed to exercise. So I was either in interrogation or I was in my cell. So it was a very bleak existence. Yeah.
You do mention that there was one particular incident involving Captain Strivik, where he seemed to have lost patience, and he threatened to take you to Benoni.
Yes.
And then he did something that I think can be described as a form of physical assault. Can you first describe what you think he meant by Benoni, and then what transpired?
My Lord, I understood when he said, I'll take you to Benoni. So if I might give the context first.
Please.
There were many people I denied knowing at all. One of those people was Cedric Mason. I had no idea that Cedric Mason had been detained. And as I described earlier, if there was one person who could corroborate that I was embarking in illegal activities, it was Cedric. They'd asked me if I knew Cedric before, and I denied it entirely. One day, Strivik came into the room where I was writing my statement, and he said, "Tell me about Cedric Mason." And I said, I don't know Cedric Mason. He's a priest, isn't he? And he got very angry. He started to scream at me. And I still denied knowing Cedric Mason. And he said, "I'll take you to see Cedric right now. We've got him down the passage." And I said, I don't know him. I was going to stick to my story. And he got unbelievably angry. Strivik was a very big guy, very big man, very powerful, very strong. He walked around the back of my chair, which I was sitting on. It's a wooden office chair, and he simply picked me up. He picked up the chair, and he was screaming at me, and then he dropped the chair, and I hit the ground with a real thud. I saw the power and the violence in that man in that moment, and it was painful, but I wasn't hurt badly at all. Prince also wanted to get in on the action, but Strivik stopped him. So it was the one point where I felt like I was very close to being beaten up, and I didn't think he was joking.
Do you think Strivik might have stopped Prince from assaulting you because of the interaction with your father?
Prince had on several occasions genuinely asked Strivik permission to beat me up. And I realized that they were holding back on me. I don't know if it was a performance, a good cop, bad cop routine, but I do believe Prince was very capable of beating me up. There was no question that these guys were they were able to beat me up. I think there were several reasons why they didn't do that in the end when looking back on it. One was my parents' activities, which I did not know anything about at that point. Second of all, I think that my father's words echoed. Third of all, because also I didn't know it right at that point, I got to learn it a few weeks later. Oret van Heerden had been very, very badly tortured. Very extremely tortured. But he didn't break. And had he broken, they would have known a lot of stuff about what I'd done that would have got me a jail sentence. But he didn't break. And so I think having not broken Oret, they probably took the view that torturing me was not going to get them anything. I have no way of knowing. But I was one of the fortunate few who wasn't physically tortured.
You mentioned that at times you were interrogated on weekends.
Yes, during those 6 weeks I was interrogated on the weekend, which was actually particularly scary because being left alone almost on an entire floor with Strivik is a scary thing. There was one weekend in particular which was particularly shocking when Strivik arrived at my cell with his son, who was then about 16 years old. And on a weekend, he had brought his son in to interrogate me, to watch his dad working. And when they opened the cell, he said to his son, "Hierdie is die Jood." And clearly he'd spoken to his son about me. And it was a moment of horror because I realized that Strivik spoke to his family about what he did. And his wife must have known. And his son certainly did. And they both took me upstairs in handcuffs. I think it was to the 9th floor that weekend. And his son sat in the interrogation while Strivik abused me. It was bizarre. I later found out from Clive that Strivik would pick Clive up from his cell on the way to taking his son to school. So he would take his son to school with Clive handcuffed in the back of his car.
So was Clive detained at another...
He was detained at another police station. And my lord, I took from this that the security police were proud of what they were doing and shared what they were doing with their families. My belief is that the families of the people who are named in this court know what their husbands were doing in John Vorster Square. And certainly I know that Struvik's son knew what he was doing, because he was there, he saw it.
And presumably he took great pride in what his father was doing.
There was no shame at all. There was no shame.
How old was the son?
I estimate about 16. He was very big, but I remember he was dressed in short pants, which maybe made him look a bit younger. About 16, 15, 16, 17, somewhere around there. No older than that.
Mr. Coleman, you indicate that you bumped into another detainee by the name of Rob Adam, who quickly advised you an interesting method of communicating with other detainees.
Yes.
What was that method?
He told me to take the water out of my toilet, and I could speak down the toilet. He told me this very quickly. I was a bit puzzled. But that night, when I did that, I just heard voices coming down to my toilet, and I realized that was the method of communication.
And were there other methods of communicating with detainees?
There were, you could shout, but generally the warders stopped you from shouting. The second main method was during meal times. The criminal prisoners would bring food. The warders would go and unlock each of the outer doors in our cells. The criminal prisoners would then come and push open the door, push the meal through a little square hatch on the footplate, and then sometimes pull the door closed completely, but sometimes leave it open a little bit. And if you were lucky, you could reach through this gap in the door and pull open the door and see the person across the passage and be able to communicate with one or maybe two people if you were fortunate. I was kept in many different cells. There were some periods when I was in a cell very, very far from everybody else, so the isolation was total. Couldn't speak down the toilet or across the passage. But those were the main methods of communication. The fourth was when you went for a shower or were given some exercise. You could meet people in the cell, and you're coming past you, and you would always communicate. Even if it was a hand gesture, you'd say something. And I can tell you a little bit more about how I ran into people's cells as well during exercise.
Yes, we're going to get to that, because there was an important encounter you had with Neil Aggett through such a means. But just to check, when you were exercising, was that typically early in the morning, around breakfast time or thereabouts?
Yes. I would say I only exercised in the morning. Usually after breakfast, and sometimes before, sometimes after shower. But usually before the shower, mostly before the shower. You'd get a few minutes to exercise. I did complain to the magistrate that we weren't getting our quota of exercise. We would get maybe 5 minutes.
But does that timing explain why sometimes the outer door was ajar or open, allowing you to communicate more freely with some detainees?
Yes, so the cell block was run by Warrant Officer McPherson, and there were some periods when there were quite a few detainees there. So he had the logistical challenge of getting everybody their breakfast, getting everybody to the showers, exercising, and then up to the 9th or 10th floor for interrogation. So what he would do most often was, after breakfast, leave the doors unlocked so that he could quickly go into whichever door had to be opened, and so he was a little sloppy, might I say, in keeping all of the doors locked, and we took advantage of that.
Right. Although, of course, the grill cage gate of each cell that would remain locked. It was only
That remained locked.
The outer door.
So the inner door was always locked. Yeah.
Yeah. You also say that you were always kept in a suicide-proof cell. So, what was a suicide-proof cell, and why do you think they kept you, in particular, in such cells?
The suicide-proof cell is a cell where there's no exposed bars. There's a box that is put around the cell door. It's made of steel or metal and perspex, and it's floor to ceiling. And where there's a window, there's a similar box that's put around it. Why they kept me in that, I, at the time, didn't think of it as myself as a suicide risk. I don't think it was because of the suicide element. I felt it was more as a punishment. It made a cell worse. It made the cell more isolated.
Do you think it might have had something to do with the fact that at the time you were only 21 and one of the younger detainees on the floor?
Perhaps. I can't read their minds into that. I was one of the younger people, but there were people younger than me as well.
You also indicate that through the different means of communication, and I think you also mentioned that the meal book, that you would sometimes be able to check, who's coming and who's going. But you managed to get a sense of where some of the detainees were located on that second floor cell block.
Yes, I did.
Now, you have attached, my Lord, Mr. Coleman has attached annexes A and B, and these are marked up versions of the floor plan. So if we turn to Annex A, it's the second floor male section floor plan. And Mr. Coleman, as you can see, has made various insertions. Mr. Coleman, can you take us through the insertions that you have made? And you have indicated to me before court that after some re-examination, and we certainly understand that this is now some 38 years later, that you do have one or two corrections to make. And so, where you wish to make a correction, please feel free to do so. You can start anywhere you like. You may want to start at the bottom left at the entrance, and then work your way up, giving the necessary descriptions.
Okay, my Lord, when I did this diagram last year, I hadn't really spent a lot of time thinking about it. I spent a little time thinking about it, but there are some things I would like to change in the diagram, if I may.
In fact, just one correction. I believe you first worked on this diagram in 2018.
Correct. And now that I've spent a lot more time remembering, there are one or two small changes I would like to make in that diagram. So on the bottom left-hand side were the showers outside of this picture to the south of this picture. There were two offices, one where our clothes, spare clothes and various other things were kept. When you were not allowed stuff in the cells, it was kept in that one room. There was also an office for the warders, Macpherson in particular. And then just to point out that I was in, to the best of my recollection, 5 different cells. They moved me certainly through my interrogation period quite frequently, so that I would not be able to hide contraband in my office, in my cell. For example, I was delighted to find a plastic spoon in the first cell I was in, which made eating dinner very much easier, less humiliating, if I may. I had to use a cardboard lid to eat my food, and a spoon was fantastic, but I lost that when I was moved to the cell on the extreme right-hand picture. I think it's B20. I can't see. There's a star on top of it. It's B24. And that cell was total isolation. There was nobody near me. I was then moved across to, I think, B7. I was in actually B13 for a period as well, which was also a cell where communication was difficult, although it gave me a direct view down the passage to the entrance gate through the keyhole. And then I was in cell B7, I believe, not B9. Sorry, let me just double check it. I think I was in cell B5, not B9, at the time when Neil died. As for other people, I remember Ernest Depali, who also died in detention, was in cell B10 for a period and B14 for a period. Jabi and Gwenya was directly opposite me in B6. In B4 was, I believe, Tozamili Gweta. And I actually think B2 was occupied by different people at different times, but I believe Caesar Njikalane might have been there.
So just to return to B4 very quickly. So that wasn't Salima Famadi?
Was not. And I believe Neil was in cell B16, directly opposite Oret van Heerden, who was in cell B26. So forgive my memory, my lord, but I was moved around a lot, and this floor plan it's difficult to place an exact memory onto this floor plan.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the reasons you say that you think Neil Aggett was in B16 and not B15, I believe you've had sight of the 2 pictures that we have handed up to the court as FGK 7, 1 and 2.
I don't have them with me right now.
We'll get them to you shortly, but the configuration of the body hanging on the other side of the grill appears to fit B16 rather than B15.
If I may describe it without actually looking at that picture, if you don't mind.
Yes.
I very distinctly remember pushing open the door and the body of the cell being on the right-hand side and the grill, the inner door grill, being on the left-hand side, and that would match B16, not B15.
Thank you. And then just to complete...
If you need me to look at that picture, I will.
No, there's no need. And if we could just turn very briefly to Annex B, that appears to point out the route that you would exercise in the corridors. Perhaps you can explain your markings here.
Yes, my lord. As I was describing Warrant Officer Macpherson, which we called him Mac, he was known as Mac, would stand in the corner just outside cell B13 and watch us run up and down. At that point, he could keep an eye on us. There was nobody in the far corridor on the right-hand side, on the east side of this diagram. So he would watch us running up and down for the period of our exercise. Occasionally, there would be somebody at the gate, which, as you can see, is in the southern portion here. Somebody would come to the gate, and he would walk down. And then the period that it took for him to walk down to the gate, unlock the gate, let the person in, relock the gate, and walk back up, I would always run to, in particular, cell B26 and cell B16, which is where Orette and Neil were, and I would push the door to see if it could open. And I would have, if it was able to open, I would have a word with Orette and Neil. And in that way I was able to communicate. And there were other people I could do, but those were the main cells that were occupied in that hidden corner while he was up at the gate.
Thank you. Mandood, it is 11:15. Might this be an appropriate time for the tea agenda?
Thank you.
All right.
If you need a rest break, relax.
Thanks.
You go through that.
Thank you.
As the court pleases. Mr. Coleman, you've already testified this morning that you yourself, you were never tortured by the security branch during your detention at John Vorster Square at this time. And you've explained your reasons why you think you were not tortured. However, you do say that you did see other detainees in a measure of distress and with such injuries. Can you explain what you were able to see and also indicate how you could see detainees in distress or with injuries?
My Lord, very soon after I was detained, I was in the corridor and I bumped into one of the detainees who I believe was in cell B3. His name was Caesar Shlongwa. Caesar Shlongwa. Hlongwa. He was an ANC member. I believe he was an MK in Controversieswa. And he'd been very, very severely beaten. And when I met him in the corridor, he was walking a little bit, he was clearly in pain. And I asked him what was wrong. Are you okay? Which is what one always asked fellow detainees. And he said, they broke my ribs. They hit me and they broke my ribs. And I said, when did they do that? And he said, a month ago. So he'd been in detention for a month with broken ribs. When I went to see Dr. Jacobson, the district surgeon, I asked him please to call for Caesar Shlongwa and to treat him. To his credit, he did that. And so Caesar did receive medical treatment. Caesar told me that the security police were very angry that Jacobson had called for him. And that was one example. When I was in cell B13, I had a very clear view down the passage through the peephole in the big wooden door.
For the benefit of the court, you can just indicate where B13 is situated on the floor plan.
B13, if you on the northern side, second from the left, it had a very direct view right down the passage all the way to the gate. And on a number of occasions, I saw security policemen carrying detainees. It wasn't always easy to identify who it was, but I saw security policemen carrying detainees, one security policeman under each arm, and dragging them down the corridor back to their cells.
And just on that score, you could discern that these were security branch policemen rather than uniform police officers or
Yes.
wardens, as you
Yes.
say.
And you could see they were dressed in plain clothes. Macpherson was known. He was the senior guy. The rest were in uniforms. Anybody not in a uniform or who was not Macpherson was a security policeman. And as I described earlier, they had free access to the cells. They would just bang on the gate and Macpherson would let them in. And then, of course, I spoke to detainees as well, both through the toilets and directly face-to-face. I would come to meet with them on the occasions that I described. And I was told about how people were tortured.
You mentioned that around Christmas time you did in fact receive some academic books. What were these books and approximately how many?
Hard to remember exactly. I think there were 4 or so books. One I distinctly remember because of the irony of it was called The State and Law. I was doing an honours degree in industrial sociology with Professor Eddie Webster and Professor Jacqueline Koch at the time. And I was supposed to write exams at the end of that year. And so I received these study materials. These books were extremely academic, very dense. And even though I'd only been in detention for a short time, probably about 40 days by that point, my concentration had gone. There was no way I could actually get through these books, and I did try. The Bible, which I'd taken in with me because I thought it was the only book I was going to be allowed to have, was easier to read. And so I spent my time reading that, even though it was less compelling to me than The State and Law.
Mr. Coleman, you also say that after your interrogation period, presumably of some 6 weeks, you started to receive weekly food parcels.
That's correct.
So just give an indication as to what would be in these food parcels.
There were, it's hard to recall exactly. I distinctly remember the biltong and the dry horse, which was my favourite food and came in increasing quantities. Impossible quantities for me to eat in the course of a week. I was distributing biltong and dry horse through the warders to other detainees. I was getting a carton of cigarettes a week. Again, impossible to smoke that number of cigarettes. And I was again using it to distribute to others. There were liquid fruits, I remember those. And I do remember fruit.
And then after about 90 days, you mentioned that you received some more books and a radio. Can you give an indication of approximately how many books? And I believe you had a small story to relate about this radio.
I do indeed. My Lord, I received about 4 or 5 books. Again, it's my memory is a little bit hazy, but I do remember reading Albert Camus, The Outsider, I think, which I heard later caused my parents great concern that I was reading existential literature in a prison, in solitary confinement. There were a number of books I received. I also received some Christmas cards, 1 or 2 photographs, which were very comforting. And I received a radio. It was a very small radio, maybe 6-7 inches wide, but it was clearly the cutting edge of technology, because I could listen to any radio station in the world on this little shortwave receiver. And in fact, took some pleasure listening to Radio Freedom while in solitary confinement, and indeed playing it down the toilets for all of the other prisoners at full volume. There was a particular opening to Radio Freedom, which was the sound of an AK-47, and it was very propagandistic, let me say. And I did it not because of the brilliant quality of the broadcasting or the clarity of the signal, but just to boost everybody. It was something that we did. We used every opportunity to lift ourselves up and everybody around us.
On the impact of being in an isolation cell and solitary confinement. Now, your account is a little too long for us to be able to read into the record, but I understand that you have identified just a handful of extracts, and I invite you to read those extracts into the record.
Certainly. My Lord, this was written in 2013, so many years after, but it was a recollection of what happened to me in that period. It's 200 pages long, and I'll spare you that. But this is an extract from that. I stepped through the cage and into the cell itself. The cage door clangs shut behind me, the lock slamming closed instantaneously. I turn, not ready for my anonymous jailer to go. I have so many questions ready to ask him, but it is too late. He is already pulling the outer door closed, already shutting it before I could say a word. For a large man, my jailer is fleet of foot and nimble of key. What I notice first is reinforced perspex fitted on the inside of the cage, stopping me from reaching the bars. It dawns on me that I am in a suicide-proof cell. I turn slowly, still not knowing, still not fully comprehending. There is no focal point in the cell, no chair, no bed, no place that draws me to it. It has no center. The walls are toilet green halfway up and colorless grey from there to the top. The ceiling is a brutal white with a high wattage light hurling light into every corner of the cell 24 hours a day. The peephole is always watching. The suicide proofing cuts out sound and air. Together these elements conjure together an ecosystem whose function is the opposite to those created in nature. It is an ecosystem whose elements conspire in perfect harmony to create a room of no discernible colour, outline or form. It is an environment numb of colour and devoid of sound and movement, the opposite of alive, the very antithesis of living. Time itself seems still, without a watch to tell me so, and without a sun to mark our travel through the heavens, or a shadow move across the earth, without the march of life through the course of a conventional day. How am I to mark time? There are no signs of life besides my own. I look inside. My inner world is a mirror image of the outer space I occupy. My heart is still and barely beats. My blood fills my veins and barely flows. My brain thinks but barely makes sense. My thoughts expand but have no soul. Where I shine light, I see only darkness. I had prepared for the interrogation, but I had not prepared for the solitary. I had seen off the questions and dealt with that threat. Am I now collapsing slowly under the weight of the confinement? I did not think so, but perhaps I had better be vigilant. My name is Keith. I am 21 years old. I say into the cell at a conversational volume. I am a detainee in John Vorster Square. I have been in solitary confinement for 52 days. I peter out. My voice had already fallen to a mumble under its own absurd weight. Speaking to no one, speaking to myself, really is crazy. Without another ear to hear, my words have no place being spoken. I have no words to say into the silence, no sensible content to engage the emptiness.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. I think those words articulate the experiences of solitary, I think, for yourself and the other detainees. Thank you. You've indicated that you received occasional visits from magistrates, but you also conclude that they were of little use. Can you explain?
I believe the magistrates were part of a system to create the appearance of due process. They were as much part of the system that enabled torture as the security policemen themselves, in my view. They would call us into an office in the cells The office that I described was occupied by Warrant Officer Macpherson. So in the very isolation cells themselves, the magistrates would come down and ask us questions about how we were. When I was feeling courageous, I would say how I was doing. But I knew it was of little use, that the magistrates would listen, write something, and then move on to the next detainee. It was form-filling at its worst, and that they could call themselves magistrates was a travesty.
You've also testified about your interaction with the District Surgeon, Dr. Jacobson, so we won't revisit that. If we can now turn to your interactions with Dr. Neil Aggett. You mentioned in your affidavit that these interactions were really brief. Can you give the court a sense of why they were so fleeting?
My Lord, when I ran into Neil's cell in the manner that I've described, I would have moments to talk to him. The questions were always, how are you doing? Are you okay? Aurette, who'd had more time to talk to Neil across the passage, had told me that Neil was struggling, that he was having a tough time. So I would always go into Neil's cell when I could and say, how are you doing? Keep strong. And even if it was a momentary interaction, it was a strong communication between us. On other occasions, if I'd bump into somebody in a passage, if I bumped into Neil in the passage, we wouldn't get long before we were pushed in the directions that we were going by the warders. But we would always stop. We would always greet each other. And whenever you're walking towards each other down a passage, you would always smile or give a salute or indicate support for each other. And so it was always very brief communications that we had. You could also shout at people through the window as they walked past. And normally the shout would be something like, be strong, or, you know, we're with you. It was always words of encouragement.
And you do give detail about one quick visit to Neil's cell during an exercise session in the corridor. And you mentioned that it did not appear as if Neil was in a good way. Can you explain further?
There were several occasions, but I think the occasion you're referring to, when I pushed open the wooden door, Neil came and held the bars, and we were standing very close. I was inside the door area, and I said to Neil, "How are you doing? How are you holding up?" And he said, "It's hard. I'm having difficulty." And he said that he was being assaulted. And he told me that they'd torn his shirt during the assault. And he said that he was keeping the shirt as evidence of the assault. By which I felt that he was still resisting, he was still strong, and he was dealing with what happened to him. And in those moments, I said to him, I sort of reached out to him and I said, be strong. And that was the message always. But it was clear that he was taking strain. He was having a hard time.
The fact that he said that he intended to keep this torn shirt as evidence, what did that suggest to you?
It suggested to me that when he had an opportunity, he was going to expose the assault that he had experienced. And he intended to do that in the future. I must say, my Lord, I presented this at the first inquest. I was told that on the grounds that the shirt was never found, my evidence was made up, not to be believed. But this is what Neil told me.
Yes. My Lord, we will return to it shortly, but the reference to that episode in the judgment was at page 3665 of the record. And that's in the judgment of magistrates. Kotso. Now, of course, trying to put a time and a date on that particular incident is not easy, and you have already indicated that when it comes to timekeeping in solitary confinement, it's practically an impossible exercise. But would you say that this was in the period leading up to Neil's death, roughly?
Yes, it was. How long before he died, I just cannot say, I'm afraid.
And you also mentioned in your affidavit that the contents of Neil's cell looked pitiful.
Yes.
Do you want to describe why it was pitiful?
On a previous occasion when I'd spoken to Neil, he told me that they'd taken away his privileges. And I think that's almost the exact words he used. And so he had very little left in his cell. There were some clothes. It's hard to recall exactly because I went into his cell on a few occasions. But there were some clothes in his cell and very, very little else. I remember, compared to my cell, by that point I had some food, I had some books, I had some photographs, I had some clothes in my cell. Not many, but compared to my few things, Neil had much less.
So, post the interrogation period, you had a few more privileges, and you were able to keep some spare clothes in your cell?
Yes, I believe I was.
Did you ever see Neil wearing a kikoi or a large scarf?
Not that I can recall.
And did you ever see a kikoi in his cell?
Again, not that I can recall. You indicate that approximately a week or so before he died, you had a chance of observing Neil in the passage outside your cell. Can you just indicate how it was you could see him and what your observations were? There were in fact two occasions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure which occasion you're referring to. There was one where I saw him through the window of my cell that looked into the corridor. On that occasion I called to him. And I'm very sure I could be heard through that window because it was often I would call to people as they were walking past and they would look up at me and see me and at least smile or do something to indicate. But on this occasion there was no response from them, which made me worried.
Can we just check with, again, reference to the second floor, Mel section floor plan? By this time, were you now in the cell number D5? Or were you perhaps in cell B13, if you can recall?
No, I was not in cell B13. I was on the B5 side of the cells, yes.
Thank you.
The B5 side.
So, my lord, that's in the short corridor leading up from the reception area.
Yeah.
Mr. Coleman, I understand that you have with you a set of 3 pictures. My lord, these are the 3 photographs that are marked G23.1, G23.2, and then G23.3. My lord, I do have a spare set, so perhaps if we can just handle it quickly. So, Mr. Coleman, just to assist you, G23.1, which is the first photograph, is in fact a picture of that short corridor, and the view is from cell B1 looking down to B10. The second photo, G23.2, is a picture of the outside of cells B1 and B3, which includes a picture of the cell windows facing the corridor. And in the last photograph, there's a somewhat closer view of the windows outside cell B4. And since we have been on that inspection with the court, certainly in that corridor, these cell windows were pretty much similar. And I think we can assume that your, at least B5 windows looked similar. And you'll notice that in the third photograph, the window is in fact open or ajar. So could you describe to the court, firstly, were there any significant differences between what was behind the windows and this photograph? Let me be direct.
Yeah.
Was that grill cage?
No, it wasn't there. The grill cage was not there. In the suicide-proof cells, there was a metal box that I've described, which had perspex over it. So you couldn't reach these windows that are opening in the photograph. And there were metal slits, very thin metal slits to let air into the cell. 3 or so at the bottom, and 3 right at the top. But otherwise, the external windows are exactly the same.
So this would you have been able to view something, for example, movement in the corridor, and perhaps you might have been able to identify individuals in that corridor?
But definitely, I could do that so long as the windows were open. I had a view into the corridor, and I could see detail. I could see faces. I could see expression. I could see people responding. So yes, absolutely.
Right. And if we can turn to the last time that you saw Neil, which you say in paragraph 58 was the week in which he died. If you could indicate to the court how it was you saw Neil on that last occasion, and again your observations.
I must have been coming back from a shower. I was walking down the corridor, and Neil was walking towards me. I remember very clearly him looking at the floor, looking down. He was very downcast, slightly stooped. I called out to Neil. I said hello to Neil, and he didn't look up. He didn't respond. And it was a shock, actually, because I realized at that point that Neil was in a very bad way. I assumed it was because of the assaults, and I was very concerned for him at that point.
Yeah. So Mr. Coleman, of course, we're asking you to reach back some 38 years, and there are times when you would have seen detainees in the corridor, and other times when you would have seen them through your cell window. So you do indicate in paragraph 58 that you saw him through the window of your cell while he was walking down the corridor.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So, sorry, I might have not been responding to your questions. So I saw him through the cell window on occasion. Once when I saw him through the cell window and called to him, he didn't respond to me. But there was also an occasion when I was walking down the passage and I saw him, and he didn't respond to me at all. And both occasions, it was clearly there was an alarm going off in my mind about his well-being. And I was very worried for him.
Right. So, Mr. Coleman, if we can now turn to the night in which Neil Aggett died. You indicate from paragraph 60 onwards that you were in your cell. Can you indicate what you were doing and what alerted you to the fact that something was going on?
Yes, I was sleeping, and I heard a commotion outside in the corridor, which was highly unusual. Usually after they locked the cells at night until food was served in the morning, there was usually nothing going on. But on this occasion I heard footsteps, I heard commotion outside my cell. So I jumped up and I ran over to the window of my cell, which was open. And I saw figures going past. And a moment later, I could hear the slamming going down the corridors, and my window slammed shut. And these Louvre windows, my lord, were just slammed shut in my face. They're opaque, so I could still make out figures moving past, but I couldn't make out any detail at all.
You indicate that you were on tiptoes when you were trying to gain sight of what was going on. Can I ask why you were tiptoeing?
I wasn't tiptoeing for quietness. I was tiptoeing because the window was slightly high, so I had to stand on tiptoes.
Right.
Anybody shorter than me would have to stand in their toilet, for example, or do something like that to see out the windows. But I was just able to see Jabu, of course, who's very tall. He was tall enough. That's how high the windows were. But for me, I just had to stand on tiptoes to look out.
I see. And if you can somehow remember the configuration of your cell, if you had to stand on your toilet, presumably you would have to sort of lean one way or the other to look out the window.
Yes, I would have to lean to my left because my door was on the left, the toilet was on the right. So I'd have to lean to the left, which means that I would be looking back down the passage towards the entrance to the cells. But I could see that way through the Louvre windows. If the cell was configured the other way, which I was in a cell which was configured the other way, I would then see down the passage in the other direction.
So you were then a little alarmed, and you shouted out to your colleagues as to what was going on.
Yeah.
Did you receive any response?
There was shouting, but nobody knew anything. We of course, we only started shouting once the movement had stopped and once everybody had left. I can't say how long that took. But once it had stopped, we waited and then started to shout to each other through the windows. But nobody knew anything, nobody could say anything. But my thoughts immediately went both to Neil, who I knew was having a tough time, and to Arette, who I knew had been very severely tortured, and his interrogation had in fact started. It hadn't stopped entirely. So I was very worried for the two of them. immediately.
And again, I'm sorry to have to put this question to you because it's so difficult to put a time to things. But was there any way of discerning whether it was still night time or whether it was now perhaps early in the morning?
It's very difficult to say. As I said, my lord, the light was on 24 hours a day. It was definitely quite a bit of time before breakfast was served. I keep calling it breakfast before food was served. It sounds like a hotel, which it definitely wasn't. It was maybe a few hours before breakfast. It's very hard to say. Very hard to say.
In reality, there was no actual way of discerning whether it was pre-midnight or post-midnight?
I really couldn't say. I did go back to sleep after that.
Right. Yeah. Then how did you discover that Neil had died?
The first I knew of it was when Warrant Officer McPherson told me. He told me that Neil had been found hanging in his cell. And that's how I found out.
And you mentioned that the day after Neil's death, things started to change, and in fact you even received a visit.
I think it was a couple of days that I received a visit from my father, my mother, and my brother Neil. It was a particularly difficult visit. There was a huge amount of tension. My parents were clearly anguished, very concerned about me. Weirdly, I was trying to reassure them. Not weirdly, but I was trying to reassure them to let them know that I was okay. I was very concerned for them and for my brother. My father, I remember asking me whether I was being mistreated, and there were two policemen in the room with us, monitoring what we were talking about and what we were saying. And they immediately said to my father, "You can't ask that." My father said, "I will ask what I want," words to that effect. So they went and ran out and called Colonel Muller. And Colonel Muller became Brigadier Muller later. Colonel Muller was the person in charge of the entire investigation. He was Cronwright's boss. And my father and he had an altercation. My father bested him, and we carried on with the visit. And so yes, I had a visit 2 days later, and then after that there were more frequent visits. They weren't often, but I believe that the Detainee Parents Board Committee managed to win the right to have more visits to monitor us after that period.
So, Mr. Coleman, you were then eventually released from John Vorster's Square on the 26th of March 1982. And this was after a period of 5 months in solitary confinement.
That's correct.
But shortly thereafter, you were slapped with a 2-year banning order and were then subjected to a period of harassment. Could you just describe that post-detention period?
My Lord, Clive van Heerden and I were both served with banning orders, which meant that even though we were living in the same house at the same time, we were not allowed to communicate with each other. I wasn't allowed to offer him a cup of tea, and I wasn't allowed to be with more than one person at a time. I wasn't allowed into a courtroom or a factory or an educational institution. We did get permission to study and finish our honours degrees at University of the Witwatersrand. oddly enough, my honours degree at that point consisted of 5 band people. So we got to meet one another during seminars. We lived under constant surveillance. I had to sign into a police station once a week. We were followed by the security police. We were allocated certain days, and I think Mondays and Thursdays were the days that I was followed. And I knew I was being followed, and there were days when Clive was being followed, so we were pretty much under constant surveillance. One day I was listening to the radio in my bedroom, and I heard Clive's voice come over the radio. So clearly that bugged our flat. We looked around, we couldn't find the bug. We went out and came home and found 2 big footprints on my bed, and clearly it had been somewhere up there. Or that was one of them, that probably had the whole place bugged. Subsequently, when I lived we moved to a different house. My landlord came home to find security policemen in the roof, changing the batteries. There was a series of car batteries in the roof, and it was connected to a network of bugs for the whole house. After that, we came home one day and found our house had been trashed. We found a pickaxe in my record player, my turntable. Things were stolen. They tried to kill me on one occasion when they pumped the tires up in my car and induced a chase, a car chase. They started to drive up behind me when I was on the M1, and they drove faster and faster and faster, and I was driving faster and faster and faster until I remembered that this was something that they did. It was one of their things that they did to kill activists. And I pulled off the M1 and went into a garage and checked my tires, and they were blown up to, I forget the number, but it was very high. We lived in constant fear. They followed us, and it was a period when also later they released Tourette, and they were going after him again, and we had him in hiding, and so they were following us, but we were hiding Tourette. So it was a very stressful time.
So it was in this rather tense context that you were then called to testify before the first inquest?
Some of this happened a little bit after.
Right.
But yes, at the time I was banned, there was a risk of redetention. I'd been subpoenaed to give evidence in 5 cases, Barbara and Hogan and Cedric Mason and so on. So that was with the intention of me refusing to testify and then going to jail for that. So it was in that context that I was asked to testify at the inquest into the death of Neil Aggett.
And you've indicated that the inquest itself was a tense atmosphere with the court gallery filled with security branch officers. You say in your statement that your conclusion is that the first inquest was a cover-up. Why did you reach that conclusion?
And the security police were a very intimidating presence in the court. Scarborough, who was the advocate, clearly wasn't interested in getting to any truth. There were no questions of what did you see next or soliciting of any information. The intention was clearly to discredit me as a witness. He made light of the fact that I claimed to have been in solitary confinement, for example. He made it appear as if it wasn't so bad. The whole tone of that inquest was one of intimidation against the witnesses who were in detention at the time. And I certainly didn't feel like I could speak out very clearly and firmly in that context. I did my best, but please remember that I was also still suffering the effect of detention and these experiences I was having. And I truly believed that my life was at risk. Every night I was sleeping in a position that I couldn't be seen from the window which looked out onto the road, because I thought they would shoot me. So I did not feel like I could speak freely in that courtroom.
And perhaps I can just read you a short extract from the judgment. And as you will recall, Magistrate Kotze did not find you to be a reliable witness. And this is what he had to say on one aspect. And my Lord, this is from page 3665. It's an extract from the judgment, starting from line 8. Keith Coleman, he was a friend who had something to say about a torn shirt. It was obvious that Mr. Coleman had some difficulty to explain how he got to know about the shirt, what was told to him, what impression he got about the details. He was uncertain. He tried to explain that he had a conversation with Dr. Aggett about the assaults during the exercise session, but later he said he could not remember when it was. More than once, Mr. Coleman blamed the effects of solitary confinement for his inability to explain certain situations. Yet certain things he does remember clearly, somewhat selective indeed. So it appears that Magistrate Kotze is completely dismissing the conditions of detention and solitary confinement and the effect that it has on detainees.
Indeed. As far as I was concerned and my colleagues were concerned, he was part of a system. The same way that the magistrates who visited us in detention were part of a system. That magistrate who ran the inquest was part of a system. And that system was designed to protect the state, to protect white privilege, if you like, to protect the security police. And that's exactly what he did.
Mr. Coleman, you mentioned in paragraph 75 that at that time you didn't believe that the story behind the 1981 detentions was simply confined to Barbara Hogan's Close Comrades document, and you suggest that there was another force at play. Can you very briefly indicate what force you think was at play?
Indeed. I believe that there was an attempt, successful attempts, to infiltrate the ANC in exile, particularly in Botswana. I think that the National Intelligence Service were intimately involved in that infiltration. I believe that there were attempts to manipulate and divide the ANC in exile from ANC supporters inside the country. Craig Williamson himself was seen in John Foster Square, and I was told he was at John Foster Square by some security policemen over that period. So he was in the 9th and 10th floor. I never saw him myself, but I was told he was there. And I believe that behind the scenes, very possibly the same people who manipulated the ANC networks to get the Close Comrades list in the first place were involved in coordinating what was to happen then and subsequently. This is speculation, my lord. I have no first-hand evidence of this. I was told by senior security policemen that Craig Williamson was in the building at the time.
And just very quickly, who was Craig Williamson?
Craig Williamson was a spy, an apartheid spy, who infiltrated the student movement in NewSAS. He was exposed as a spy by Cedric de Beer, Oret van Heerden, and others. He infiltrated the ANC in exile, although he was exposed during that period, so I don't think he got very far in his infiltration. But I do believe he managed to set up a network of spies that he worked with.
And who was he working for?
He was working for the National Intelligence Service.
Thank you. Mr. Coleman, looking back, what do you think happened to the late Dr. Neil Aggett?
My Lord, I must be honest, I lived for many years with the belief that Neil committed suicide under the pressure of his interrogation and not being able to go back again to face further torture, and that it was an induced suicide caused by the torture. I've thought about the events and thought about where that belief came from. I could trace that belief to the moment that Warrant Officer McPherson told me that Neil had been found hanging in his cell. And the picture formed at that moment. And when I thought back on the events that early morning, people running past the cell, I immediately formed the view that they were running to, on the news, that they had found him hanging in his cell. In retrospect, there is nothing to say that those people were not running for a different purpose. The only seed that was planted in my mind was by McPherson. And how would he know what happened? He only came on duty in the morning. So there is an alternative explanation. There's no reason to say that those people were not running in to bring Neil's body into the cells or something. I have no evidence one way or the other. What I do know is that Neil was brutally assaulted. I do know that that the assaults continued, and that they got worse. They went from a point where Neil was able to say, "I'm holding the shirt in order to expose what has happened." He went to a point where I could see in his walk and in himself, he was in terrible shape. His eyes were downcast. And that's the memory I have of Neil now. He's somebody who was in physical pain, emotional difficulty. So I believe whether it was induced suicide or whether they killed him, or I believe the torture led to his death.
Mr. Coleman, before we close your evidence in chief, is there anything further you'd like to add?
I would, Your Honour, if I may. I've prepared something to say, if I might, my Lord. The injustice of the situation that we're in is perverse. The torture of Neil and others, like my very good friend Stanza Bopapi, and the real causes of their deaths were covered up by a police conspiracy supported by the magistrates and the judicial process. Neil's family and friends have never discovered the truth, while his torturers and his killers have escaped justice, either taking their guilt to their graves or hiding the truth and integrating themselves into the new South Africa by exploiting the skills they've learned, trying to prevent the emergence of a democratic South Africa. I believe it is high time his killers are brought to account, and I respect the work of this court in trying to do so. My Lord, I understand that I am the last of the detainees to give evidence. Over the last weeks, you have heard the testimony of many detainees. You have heard testimony about what we saw happen to Neil. You have also witnessed the trauma each of us still live with today. There are other cases to be heard, other inquest to be held. We asked the judiciary, the NPA, and the Minister of Justice to please learn from these last weeks. When you open an inquest, you open an old wound. That is not to say these inquests should not go forward. They absolutely should. When you call ex-detainees to testify, you ask us to live our trauma once again. If you ask any of us back again, for example, to testify about Ernest de Parley, another who was detained with us and died at John Vorster Square, you will be asking us to live that trauma again. I would appeal to your Lordship and others in the justice system, as you correctly pursue justice, to please consider this in the future. Finally, I would like to say this, my Lord. We ex-detainees are not victims, and we do not wish to be seen as victims. We stood up to a system that was unjust, racist, violent, that delivered to the few, not the many. We knew the risks of detention, persecution, even death. We stood with our comrades nonetheless and fought for what we believed in: democracy, social justice, economic justice, redistribution of wealth from the few to the many, freedom of speech, the values enshrined in the Freedom Charter. We stood up to the system along with thousands like us, and we fought. We might have paid a price, but we won. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. No further questions, Your Lordship.
Thank you, my Lord.
Mr. Coleman, you have to wait the question.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Madam. Mr. Coleman, good day. I just have a few questions for you. You testified that there were crosses on the lawn that were placed across Wits University campuses. Was this in commemoration of the 1976 June 16? Or was that the reason why it was done?
That's correct. This was June 16, 1977.
Your banning orders that you testified about, this was regarding you and Clyde van Keerden. You had to apply to the magistrate for variation, am I correct?
It was in fact to the Minister of Justice.
So inevitably it went to the Minister of Justice, but through the magistrate, would I be correct?
My lawyers wrote the letter, I believe, directly to the Minister of Justice.
If it came from the Minister of Justice, as to who you could speak to and what you could do, did you get the impression that the police and whatever their actions that they undertook or whatever it was that they did, the ministers were aware, or everybody was aware of what was happening within the judicial system?
Yes, I believe so. I, to this day, believe it was a single system that was very well coordinated. This was confirmed for me subsequently when I managed to read the contents of the file that was sent by the security police to the Justice Ministry justifying my banning, which I might add was filled with all sorts of lies and inaccuracies. There was no due process, of course. The security police said what they liked, and the Ministry of Justice just accepted it. It was an administrative process, so they never examined whether what they were getting from the security police was accurate. So yes, indeed, it was a single system, and the Minister of Justice signed my banning order on the basis of a file delivered by the security police.
Do you believe that the police had a duty of care? That while you were there as a detainee, they had a responsibility to make sure you and the rest of the detainees were well taken care of?
It's a very difficult question to answer, my Lord, in the sense that you're applying a moral code. Words like duty of care would have been laughed at. It wouldn't have had a translation in that context. That whole system was designed not to care. It was brutal. The approach that the security police took to interrogation was not intelligence-based. They didn't think carefully about your answers. They didn't thread together different things they heard. Their interrogation technique, their intelligence gathering technique, was to scream, shout, beat you up, torture you, and get the facts that they were looking for in the first place. I believe that Major Cronwright, Colonel Muller, had a theory, a hypothesis about what was going on, about this conspiracy. And they basically beat people up to prove it.
Mr. Coleman, you testified that there was a time that you saw detainees being held on either side, and in all probability it was the security branch because of the fact that they were in plain clothes. Where were the uniform branch people at this time when a detainee is being held on either side and taken to his cell?
They would usually be standing at the gate opening it. They would open the gate and the person would be dragged in. And they would then have to run down the corridor with a key to open whichever cell it was.
So obviously they were very aware of what the special branch was doing, am I correct?
Yes.
You testified that Neil had said to you at some stage that all his privileges were taken away.
Correct.
And towards the last, once or two occasions that you had seen him, he looked down. Now, the question I'm putting to you is that, at the inquest itself, the police went out of their way to put up a fantastic list of all the privileges that Neil that was found in Neil's cell. For example, there were sweets and biscuits, and then there was books and games, how to play chess, books on how to play chess, and even 5 pairs of socks and a tie. What do you say to that?
There's no way they would allow a tie. I mean, just the idea of a tie, and what would you have a tie for in the first place? But there was absolutely no way they would let you have a tie. Even though I had privileges, I was never allowed shoelaces or a belt. I never saw in Neil's cell any evidence of biscuits or books or games. Definitely not. The cell that I saw whenever I went in there was pretty bare.
During the time that you were at the cells, were there any cell visits? Do you remember, especially in the evenings?
Cell visits?
Where the police would come and check on you and see whether you are okay?
Yes,
in the
yes,
evenings?
yes, there were.
Mm-hmm.
There was one particularly horrible one for me, where I was asleep. This was about 2 weeks after Neil died, and a drunk warder would come around and look at us, and he was shouting at us to stand up. And when I went, and this was very late, I was sleeping. When I went across to the bars to say, "Why are you making me stand up?" he'd say, "So I can see you haven't hung yourself." I said to him, "How am I supposed to hang myself lying down?" I said, "Please don't wake us up." And he started to abuse me. And then across the other side, Jabu he used the K word with Jabu. So there was an unusual occasion, but there were frequent checks.
Was this the time that you had made a report to the magistrate regarding this same drunk warder?
I did subsequently make a complaint, yes.
So you said drunk warder?
A drunk warder. White cop. He wasn't one of the usual black warders. He'd come down from somewhere. I'd never seen him before. I think he was just having fun, and that was what the police defined as fun. Waking up and abusing detainees. I didn't particularly care for him or about him. For me, it was just another thing to resist, another thing to stand up to.
Mr. Coleman, I just want to go to the night before the time period that we say that Neil died. You said that on that particular night, the windows were closed. They were initially open and then they were closed. Were those windows ever closed prior to that?
Never.
Was that the first time?
It was the first time that those windows were closed.
I don't want to rehash, any or reopen any old wounds. I just want, before I ask the final question, this Mr. Scabot, is this the legal representative for the police?
I believe so.
That you spoke. Okay. And then Mr. Dipale himself, how long were you detained at John Vorster Square before Mr. Dipale passed away? Can you recall?
It's hard. I know I was detained for 155 days. Ernest was... Maybe he was there when I arrived. I don't recall. I do know he was subsequently released and then redetained.
Yes.
But I believe he was there when I was released. I believe he was still there. He hadn't yet passed away.
My Lord, I have nothing further for this witness.
Thank you, Lord. Coleman, I understand that it is a difficult time for you to relive, and also to remember everything is difficult. We appreciate this. At the time of Dr. Aggett's death, his cell, would you say that you saw his cell recently before he died, or can you give any kind of an indication as to how long before he died did you see his cell?
My Lord, it's difficult to tell exactly, but it was certainly no longer than a week to 10 days. But it's very difficult for me to be precise about that period.
And the extra clothes that you kept in your, or that you had in your cells, what type was it? What was it? Extra shirts? Can you just perhaps briefly on that?
There was one particular T-shirt which I had, which my parents sent to me, which said on it, "If you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with bull." And I wore it once to an interrogation session.
And, did you have extra sets of clothes? For example, extra pants, extra underwear, extra shirts then?
Yes, I did. Those were mostly kept in the office, in the
your cell?
I don't recall having much more than that. It was a T-shirt. We were allowed very limited clothes in the cell. I must be honest, I can't remember precisely everything that was in my cell. I do remember the books, and one or two other items I do remember as well.
And did you, for example, have cards, like playing cards?
I was in fact sent a bridge game, a little manual bridge game to teach yourself how to play bridge. So I did have that.
And just normally the sleepwear, did you sleep in your clothes, or did you have, for example, pajamas or some form of a pajama?
I did not have pajamas. I slept in a T-shirt and shorts.
Do you know what a koi is?
I do.
So it's Kenyan men that tie it around their waists, for example. I'm sure there are many other uses therefore, but it can be tied and worn around the waist. You have never seen Dr. Aggett with something around his waist, striped cloth around his waist?
No, I didn't. Not that I can recall.
So during your interrogation, what were they after? What was the one thing that they wanted from you during the interrogation?
They wanted me to prove the hypothesis that I and Rhett and others, Clive, our network, were operating under orders from the ANC, that there was indeed a conspiracy. The key things that they wanted from me was to get names of people that I knew, to expose my network, and also my deeds. They interrogated me at length about the books that I had given to Guy Berger, for example, and they wanted me to incriminate myself that so that I could be sent to jail. When I denied this, they said, Guy told them that I gave them the books, and I said, I know he's in prison, bring him here and I'll tell him he's a liar. And so that was the way that they went. What I did do is I wrote down a lot of people I'd seen in the context of stories, which were all in the newspaper. But there were some times when they specifically wanted to bring me examples of, for example, Cedric Mason, examples when I should incriminate myself and incriminate him. But of course, that's something I did not do.
At that stage, of course, it was, although history, it was a crime to be part of the ANC and or to support the ANC. Was that so?
Yes.
Crime in terms of the legislation.
Yes, and what they called furthering the aims of a banned organisation.
And were they of the view that you, in fact, were furthering the aims of the ANC?
Yes, they were. They were firmly of that view.
And the people they wanted you to expose, were they also people that they thought, wrongly or rightly, that they thought were furthering the aims of the ANC?
Yes, they were trying to create, they were trying to crack the conspiracy as they saw it. And the word crack is really what they were doing.
And you said they were breaking you, trying to break you. Physically or mentally? Or
in my case, mentally.
And the breaking was to convince you to expose, to admit and to expose.
Yes, was to give them information that they could use.
So the detainees that you saw that were dragged in the passages there on the second floor, were they carried? Were any of them carried? I understand dragging to mean that their feet are on the ground and people under their arms drag them. They might not be able to walk, but they are dragging them.
Yes, that's correct.
You haven't seen people being carried over the shoulder, for example?
No, I didn't.
And how many people would be involved in such dragging? One or two or three?
There were at least two on the one occasion when I saw this happening. There were two, one under each arm, and the excuse me, and the warder behind.
So at the night that Dr. Aggett died, and you, if I understand you correctly, later when it calmed down in the passages, there was some screaming and shouting as to what had happened. Were there any communications through the toilet telephone? I can call it that.
No.
And in the shout...
Sorry, can I just say we stopped communicating. I don't remember communication happening in that period. I think that there was a lot of activity and there was a lot of nervousness, and the one thing that we could not afford to let happen was to be caught.
If you were to shout to each other, did the wardens, did the uniformed police, did they try and intervene or stop you from communicating by shouting?
Some did, some didn't.
On this particular night, after it calmed down, and there was then, as I understand you, some shouting as to what has happened, did anybody said anything in relation to Dr. Aggett during this shouting?
No.
There was no indication during that conversations that something has happened specifically to him?
Not that I heard. But there was questions about Neil and Arrett, but we didn't. There was no specific shouting about it.
Nobody, for example, said, "I saw what happened."
No,
or shouted to say that this is what I observed that happened to Dr. Aggett.
No.
Thank you, Lord. I've got no further questions to the witness.
Any questions?
More questions?
Re-examination?
My Lord, just one or two questions on re-examination. Just for the record, my Lord, the question in relation to Ernest Depali. So this witness was released on the 26th of March 1982. And according to our records, Ernest Depali was found dead in his cell on the 8th of August 1982. Mr. Coleman, the time of Aggett's death was in early February. That would have been in the height of summer.
That's correct.
So typically, temperatures are quite warm at that time. So late at night, and for purposes of sleeping, well, let me put it this way: you've already testified that for purposes of sleeping, you would be in a t-shirt and shorts. But at night, when you were not being taken out for interrogation, in summer, what would you typically wear in your cell?
Maybe long pants, maybe short pants, a t-shirt.
Not for the question.
My Lord, I'm sorry. Before His Lordship asks a question, I just have one question. Mr. Coleman, you heard my learned friend put to you that if you belong to the ANC, it was that time that it was a crime. But would you agree with me, even if it was a crime, there were certain processes in place? If you were arrested and if it could be proven without statements under duress that you belong to a banned party, that you would be brought before a court, that there will be certain penalties in place. Am I correct? Certain sanctions.
Correct.
So it was not for the police to be the judge, jury, and executioner. Am I correct?
You're correct that's how it should have operated.
Yes.
Unfortunately, it didn't always.
Thank you, my Lord. Nothing further for this witness.
Thank you. Mr. Coleman, I just wanted to find out this night when you say that you had a commotion on the corridor, were you asleep or were you woken up by the commotion?
Yes, my Lord, I was woken up by the commotion.
Did it appear to you that there were many people, were they running around or were they just shuffling or what was happening?
No, there were many people, 4 or 5 at least, and they were moving very quickly. When I went to the window of the cell, they were moving past very fast, and then after the cell windows were closed again, I saw people moving up very quickly as well.
At that time, on that day, I believe you were was it in cell B3?
My Lord, if you'll give me a moment. I believe it was B3, correct.
You were in cell B3, which is very close to the reception.
Yes.
So, did these people then move from the reception area and past B3 further towards B12 and 13 and 14? Did they
Correct.
move in that direction?
They moved in that direction. Lord. And I remember, yes, sorry, I was just remembering that when the gate opened, I was almost the first in the firing line to be caught if I was talking down the toilet, so B3 was very close to the gate.
Now, one of the detainees who gave evidence, I'm not sure whether it was Jabu Ngwenya. He says he saw people carrying a person that he identified as Neil on their shoulders and moving past that.
I
Did not see that.
I did not see that.
Am I right? Because Jabu said that.
My Lord, it was in fact Cesar Njikalana.
Yes. Did you know Cesar Njikalana?
I knew him well.
In which cell was he?
I believe he might have been in B10 or B8, one of those.
No. McPherson is the one who told you, broke the news about the death.
Correct.
What time was it?
That was in the morning meal. That was when he opened the gates
For the meal.
for the meal. Lord, one of the things that I did was try to develop communication with the warders, and Macpherson and I had a friendly but tense relationship, and he did communicate with me. So he told me what happened.
He said Neil has died, or Neil has hanged himself. What did they actually say?
Words to the effect that Neil was found hanging in his cell.
Was found hanging in his cell.
Although, my lord, I must quickly say that I don't remember the exact words, but it was words to that effect.
None, my lord.
My Lord, just one aspect for clarification. Mr. Coleman, in your evidence in chief, you indicated that on the night in question, when you heard the commotion, that you were in cell B5, which is in fact right next to B3. So is there the possibility that it could have been B5 or B3?
Sorry, let me clarify. Let me just get a picture of myself, because it's about where the door is that I find this map slightly difficult to use.
And I should say for the record that this map does not reflect the floor plan with the greatest of precision.
No.
And we will be getting the floor plans from the architects later this week. But to the best of your ability, please advise.
Yeah, it would have been B5, my lord, not B3. The door was on my left. The toilet was on my right.
So, my Lord, for the record, B5 is right next to B3.
Yes.
Thank you, Lord. No further questions.
Lord, if I may just add one question to the witness. Sir, did Mr. Sizan Jakalana, did he ever discuss with you that Dr. Aggett was carried shoulder height into the cells?
No, he did not.
Thank you, Lord.
Can I just add to that, if I may? That we became very wary of communicating anything. We knew that the security police knew about our communications down the toilet. We know that anything that we said down there, and this was almost the whole way through, that was extremely sensitive, was unwise to say. So we kept our communications very cautious, and in the period after Neil's death, they increased the visits in the evening to the cells and watched it more carefully. So, to the best of my recollection, the amount of communication that we had decreased significantly over the next period. So there was very limited discussion that took place about anything that we knew.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord. No further questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Coleman.
Thank you, my lord.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You guys seen our one
The Lord, as mentioned in chambers this morning, we had hoped to have called Mr. Paul Erasmus, but for the reasons alluded to, we were unable to call him this afternoon. So he will appear tomorrow morning. But in the circumstances, we do not have a witness this afternoon.
tomorrow, the 11th of February, for that.
rise.
No, they must come. I call him. You remember last week when I spoke to him?